And we are on air. Hello, everybody, and welcome to my show. I've got a special guest on my show today. His name is Ernst Roets. He is the Deputy CEO of Afriforum, and they are currently on a tour in the United States of America to lobby against the expropriation of land without compensation and farm murders. Hello, Ernst.
Hi, Willem. It's good to speak to you.
How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's still morning here, but it's a beautiful day and it's summer.
All right, perfect. Ernst, can you tell us, please, what are Afriforum doing for the ordinary citizens of South Africa there in America now?
Well, the reason why we are in America at the moment is as part of our campaign, actually two campaigns, the campaign against expropriation without compensation, as well as our campaign against farm murders. And we are here to raise awareness about the problem in South Africa, but also to gather international support to get people abroad to understand the problem more comprehensively, and also to inform them of ways in which they might be able to help.
Okay, great. Can you tell us, who did you reach out to and who did you speak to?
Well, we spoke with a variety of people and organizations, and we still are. We've got some big meetings coming up today as well. But broadly, I think you can divide them up in three groups. I think the first one is think tanks or research organizations, which we know is very important strategically, because those are the institutions that do research on a regular basis. Those are the people that are most informed, and those are the people that advise members of government, and they have a very big reach in terms of influence. So we're making a very strong effort to speak to as many think tanks as we can. Then other than that, we are, of course, speaking to the media. We've done quite a few interviews yet, or to date. And other than that, also, we will be speaking to representatives of the United States government.
All right, let's start with the media. Who can you tell us about? Who did you speak to in the media?
Well, we've just last night, we had an interview on Tucker Carlson Tonight, which is, of course, a primetime show on Fox News. The interview went really good. It hasn't been broadcast yet, so I'm assuming that it will be aired tonight. We've spoken to a few other people. We are in corresponding with the Wall Street Journal at the moment, for example. But I think the interview on Fox News was a really big breakthrough for us.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, Tucker Carlson is the second, the second most popular talk show host in the United States, and he's on the most popular show in the United States, which is Fox News, and he gets about 2.5 million viewers per episode. Am I right? So
yeah.
that's gonna reach a lot of people.
Yeah, and it's broadcast in 86 countries, so it's really an international. You don't get Fox News in South Africa, but well, you can get it in ways that are a bit difficult. But the point is that it's not only a show in the United States; it's something that is watched across the world.
Yeah, I see a lot of people here in the comments are saying how much they appreciate Tucker Carlson and how friendly he is to our cause.
Oh, yes, certainly.
What is Afriforum's political strategy with this tour?
Well, firstly, Afriforum is not a political party, but it would be, I think, misdirected to say that Afriforum has nothing to do with politics. So we need to differentiate between politics in the broad sense of the word as opposed to party politics. So if I'm using the word politics, or if we are using the word politics, I'm particularly referring to it in the broad sense of the word. So the point here for us is we know how the ANC operates. The ANC, more than any other political party in South Africa, puts a lot of effort into writing down their strategies and their tactics and publishing it on their website. And the ANC is, of course, very much still stuck in the Cold War mentality. They still use all those old Marxist terms in their way of speaking. And one of the things they say, which is a part of their strategy their modus operandi, is the balance of forces. And what the balance of forces means is that you need to consider who has the ability to seriously influence public opinion, and you need to determine to what extent is the balance of forces in your favor and to what extent is it in your opposition or in opposition to you. And that's the main reason why we have come to the US, to influence this balance of forces. In other words, I'm putting it now in ANC terms, but what that means is that to get international support, to make sure that the ANC realizes, or the government realizes, that if they continue with this, they would lose all credibility. It would become an international embarrassment for them. They would lose this wave that they've been riding since 1994, that the ANC and the new South African government is a government and a party of freedom. It's the party of Nelson Mandela, and they are just freedom-loving people, which we know is not true. And if we go abroad and we expose them for that, they might get a lot of international criticism, and they might get a lot of pressure from abroad. And that would influence the balance of forces, which we know is something that the ANC takes very seriously.
I see there are some Americans here who asks what exactly these reparations are, from whom to whom, and for what. Yeah.
Well, I'm assuming they're referring to land reform now. So that's actually a very, very important question. And I think the issue about land reform in South Africa is something that you need to go into. You need to go into the detail of history. So what the narrative in South Africa at the moment is: whites stole the land must be given back, or blacks were dispossessed by whites, therefore white people must hand their property over to black people. So then the first question is it true? And yes, it's true that black people were dispossessed. But the second question is, who were dispossessed? How many were dispossessed? And where were they dispossessed? And yes, there were dispossessions. But there's a major logical leap in the current mainstream argument in South Africa. So no one in South Africa is saying that there were no dispossessions. White people and black people were dispossessed, because that's how the apartheid system worked. That there were white homelands and black homelands, and white people who lived in the areas that were designated to black people they were dispossessed, and the other way around. So then now there's a major leap that says, well, black people were dispossessed. In other words, some black people were dispossessed, and now all white people are criminals, or all white people are land thieves, and all black people need to be compensated, which doesn't make sense. And what we should also say is we've had a quarter of a century of reparations, of a land claims process, and people being paid for places where they were dispossessed. So there was a process of land claims, of which we know 93% of the people who instituted land claims said they would rather want money than land. But there has been such a process of reparations, of compensation for people who have been dispossessed. And now that that process is finished, now suddenly the argument is black people were dispossessed. Now we need to be even more aggressive. And now there's this push for redistribution, which is actually not even redistribution, it's nationalization. That's what the policy is about. It's about the state owning the land and then allowing people to work on state-owned land.
I'm seeing a lot of people here in the comment section pointing out the ANC is a communist party and the communist strategy. What is your comments on the red danger, or the danger of communism in the world at this moment?
Yeah, well, this is something that people get sort of mocked about in South Africa. There were two things. People were, especially white people before 1994, they were told that, sort of ridiculed about the swart gevaar or the black danger, and also the red gevaar, or the rooi gevaar, or the red danger. And it was then said, especially that communism has been discredited. The Soviet wall, or the Berlin Wall, has fallen in 1989. Communism is over. Democracy has reigned. And at that time, in the early 90s, that's also when Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, came out, which was still is a very influential, very well-read, very famous book. And he argued that the fall of the Berlin Wall signaled the end of communism. And he said that the consequence of the fact that the Berlin Wall has fallen would be that communism would be discredited. I'm sort of paraphrasing to an extent, but that communism is discredited, that it's only a matter of time before the entire world becomes liberal and democratic. And he said this really is the end of history, because everyone's going to be liberal and democratic. And he went even further by saying that, to be honest, it's going to be quite boring. So that was in the 90s, and people really believed that communism is dead and communism is over. But in South Africa, the South African Communist Party, as far as we could determine, have about 40% of members of cabinet, ministers and deputy ministers in the South African government are members of the Communist Party. And we do know, of course, there's an alliance between the ANC and the South African Communist Party, and many within the ANC describe themselves as communists. And we also know that the relationship between the ANC and the Communist Party, as they describe it, is that there's a big engine and a small engine. And the big engine is the ANC, and the small engine is the Communist Party. And the role of the big engine is sort of to mobilize and to do the operational work. But the role of the small engine, which is the Communist Party, is to provide ideological direction. That's how they frame it. And that is what we see in South Africa. The Communist Party, although there's a large degree of friction now, not due to ideological issues, more due to corruption issues and political issues. There's a degree of friction between the ANC and the Communist Party. But the fact that communism has taken hold in South Africa is a very real reality, and you would be very naive to try to argue that communism is dead in South Africa.
I would like to point out that you can see that in the media. The media is extremely left-wing here in South Africa. Some people even say that the Huffington Post is considered the center of our media, and in America they are considered being extreme socialist and left-wing.
Yeah, yes, we do. It's probably part of a global phenomenon, or the fact that the media tends to be more left-wing or liberal, not in the classical sense of the word, but it's especially true in South Africa. And there's been some studies about that. I especially saw some studies in the US about the difference between college professors, the ideological views of college professors and their students, and also the difference between journalists and their readers in terms of their worldview. And it's certainly true in South Africa, and there could be a variety of reasons for that. One of it could be that people who tend to be more liberal tend to choose to go into courses such as journalism and so forth more, while people who tend to be more conservative tend to choose other courses and so forth. All of those things play a role. But the point is, in South Africa, I would almost say journalists are like police officials, in the sense that we have some very, very good police officers in South Africa who really dedicate their lives to doing their job and who are prepared to die doing so. And then there are some seriously corrupt police officers. And unfortunately, the corrupt ones tend to sort of raise to the top more or quicker. And I think it's the same with journalism in South Africa. I have some of my friends are journalists, to use that term. I have friends who are journalists, and I know a lot of journalists in South Africa. And I have to say the vast majority of them, I would say, are really honest people who want to do their job and who want to report the news. But what we also find is in certain influential positions, certain editors of newspapers and news outlets, for example, are extremely, I don't even think liberal is the right word. I would say extremely, maybe left-wing, but certainly very activist.
How about socialist?
Yeah, I think socialist is also an appropriate word to use. So, and they are very outspoken about this, and they have some campaigns. They have their own campaigns, and they are using their platforms to drive campaigns to support those with whom they agree ideologically, and to try to demonize those with whom they disagree as much as they can, even if it means, even if in the process they discredit or destroy their own credibility. It's as if the gratification they get from demonizing those with whom they disagree on an ideological or from an ideological perspective, or those whose views don't fit their own ideological narrative. The gratification they get from that outweighs the need or the necessity or the urge they have to to keep their credibility intact?
I see an interesting question here from a guy named Steve Hofmeyer. Aren't the other countries today too preoccupied with their own walls and segregation and migration restrictions to even acknowledge how they sponsored the fall of a small sovereignty in South Africa back in the day? What do you think about that?
Just repeat the first part. He said, aren't other countries more or too
preoccupied with their own problems with migration to acknowledge how they sponsored the fall of the sovereign state in South Africa back in the day?
Yes, well, that's true. The fact that the ANC has received a very large degree of support from abroad. And so we have this joke, which we've made to some of the people that we've spoken with here in Washington. And so we would say to them, we are here to speak to you about South Africa because we know you keep thinking about South Africa and nothing is more important to you than South Africa. And you probably dreamt about South Africa last night and we're here to talk about this. And they would all laugh because the point is that people in the US have, especially people in Washington, have very little interest in South Africa. And that is what we want, what we aim to change. But it is certainly so. And that's one of the things also that we say. We've said this to everyone we've been speaking with, is to understand what's happening in South Africa. You need to understand the National Democratic Revolution. And what I'm about to say about the National Democratic Revolution might sound conspiratorial, but I'm actually quoting from the ANC website. So let me explain it the way the ANC explains it themselves. So the National Democratic Revolution is something that came from the 80s. And during the early 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, one person who was particularly influential in this strategy was Joe Slovo, who was Secretary General of the Communist Party. And so the Berlin Wall had fallen, and that's when F.W. de Klerk started negotiations. And Joe Slovo's advice to the ANC, despite the fact that he was leader of the Communist Party, was that the ANC should not frame itself or portray itself as being communist. They should rather portray itself as being pro-freedom, as being liberal, as wanting to protect the free market and the rule of law and so forth. And then they had what they regarded as sort of a two-prong approach. So the strategy, the National Democratic Revolution, was about positioning themselves as something that would get international support, as being pro-freedom and liberal, as I said, which they succeeded in very, very, they had an immense success with this. Then they got state power. They won the election. They got a lot of support. They got a lot of funding from abroad. And then the National Democratic Revolution is about, now that they have the government, now that they do have the power, now that they control the state apparatus must now be used to further the goals of the revolution. And the goals of the revolution, according to their own documents, is to gradually transform South Africa into a socialist state. So that's why in South Africa, when we hear about what they call the second transition, we need to go into a second transition. What they really mean by that is we need to go to the second phase of the National Democratic Revolution. And so, yes, the first phase of the National Democratic Revolution, to answer Steve's question, was to sort of mislead the international community to believe that they are something which they were not. And now the second phase is to use the power that they have achieved to implement all of these policies. And we can see it in action in South Africa.
I think that's a very, very strong message to the international community. I'm seeing a lot of questions here in the comment section. People asking you, Ernst, what do you think about independence movements like the Cape Independence Movement and Orania and others like that?
Well, self-determination is, I did my master's degree on this, and I'm registered to do my doctorate in this as well, or in minority rights, but with a focus on self-determination as well. It's something that's very popular abroad, internationally. At the United Nations, it's very politically correct to talk about self-determination. But in South Africa, it's very politically incorrect to talk about this. And it's regarded as racist and all of those things. But I think the underlying important thing, which no one can deny, is that, well, there are some who actively try to deny this, it's always better for a community to have a degree of decision-making powers over their own interests. And that can be done in a variety of ways. And that is something that we as Afriforum very strongly supports.
I'm glad to hear that.
That there must be a degree of authority to decide over your own interests. And there are many ways people think about self-determination, and they think of secession, which is one form of self-determination. In other words, getting like a homeland. But there are other ways to do this as well, which is what I'm currently studying. And so there are internal and external forms of self-determination. One form could be that a particular community that complies with certain requirements get a degree of self-government, in the sense that they can establish a cultural council, they can have representatives, they can use their own tax money while they live in another country, or in a country where they are a minority. They can use their own tax money, and they can make their own decisions about their tax money in a way that deals with their own interests, such as having your own policies for your own schools, for your community. That's also something that's abroad. It's very politically correct, and it's very popular. In South Africa, it's very controversial. Another way could be just decentralizing power. We have a very, very centralized state in South Africa. So you can decentralize power by giving less power to the central government and more power to local communities, to provinces, or to local area communities. And that would already give people a much bigger degree of influence or control over their own interests. So there are a variety of ways, and there are a variety of ways in which this could be achieved. And in principle, we certainly agree with this.
Would you talk a bit about Switzerland? Obviously, this is your field of study, and Switzerland is an extremely successful country. Do you think we can apply some of the same systems that they apply there?
Yes, well, we can. So they have this canton system in Switzerland. I think maybe if I can answer your question a little bit more broadly. So what I'm looking at in terms of my own studies at the moment is a variety of different systems, and how are they working how does it work in their own countries, and then also in which ways could it be applied in South Africa. So one thing that's very interesting is, for example, in the Ethiopian constitution, there's a clause that says you have a right to secession. In other words, you have a right to sort of break off from Ethiopia and start your own country. But the argument there is that if the right is there and it is protected, then people's inclination to want to do so would be less. So there are so many different systems. Estonia has a system which is almost like the one I explained, where people can, if they comply with certain criteria, they can get a degree of funding and make a degree of decisions about their own issues that affect themselves. Canada, of course, has a system protecting the French-speaking community. And a very interesting case study, I think, is something that we need to look more to, is South Tyrol in the north of Italy. In the northern province of Italy, it's a German community, majority German in that province. And they have had a power struggle as a minority community for quite some time. And they are now at the point where they can get they refer to it as an autonomous province. So it's a province of Italy, but they have a much higher degree of influence and decision-making powers over their own interests. And so they are now at the point where they can use 90% of their tax money for themselves. So they still pay taxes. 10% goes to the national government, and 90% they can decide for themselves what has to be done with that. And so it's a flourishing economy. It is now one of the wealthiest regions in the whole of Europe. Some say it's the wealthiest region. So practically speaking, that's a case study that we can take a lot from. I think the biggest challenge that we as Afrikaners have in South Africa is we are actually quite a big group. We tend to think of ourselves as a small community, but there are about, just referring to Afrikaners, there are about 2.7 million of us, which is bigger than the populations of many countries in the world, including Scotland and Namibia and so forth. I think our challenge is that we are spread out across a very large surface where we are in the minority almost everywhere. So there's not really a place where we are in the majority. And I think that is a challenge for Afrikaners, or maybe the biggest challenge from a economical, political perspective.
I'm seeing Rational Gent here made a very interesting comment. The biggest problem that we have with all these theories and plans that are very good in theory is that the communists will never decentralize their power. And I think that's what we are up against here in South Africa.
Yeah, I want to respond to that because that's true. But I think the biggest thing in terms of the issue of self-determination or self-governance, whichever term you prefer to use, there's one major thing that I believe, or we believe, most people who talk about this don't really understand. And I think this is the major determining factor in terms of how do you achieve this, or how does it work? And most people who talk about this issue think that the de jure reality should come first and the de facto should come second. In other words, you should get recognition first, and once you have recognition, then you should build it. So that's why we have a lot of people, well-meaning, well-intentioned people who want to go and speak to the president, for example, or the government about receiving a degree of recognition of the fact that they have the right to sort of have a degree of control over their own interest. In other words, people saying, for example, we have groups saying, we want some form of an area where we can govern ourselves, so we now have to go and claim that from government. That's not how it works. It's never worked like that. And the only thing that they will say is no. So a process like this works the other way around. And that's, I think, our tour here in the United States is maybe a micro example of that. And that's that the de facto reality comes first, and recognition of the de facto reality comes second. So recently, for example, we had, well, let's take South Tyrol as an example that I've mentioned. They didn't go to the Italian government and ask them for having to use 90% of their tax money. Well, initially they did, and the Italian government just said no. So they were also oppressed in ways very similar to South Africans, although much worse. So they, for example, were banned from having schools in German, which is slightly similar to a road that we might be going down in South Africa. They were even forced to change their names. So if you were if you had a German name and you lived in that area, you had to change your name so that it could be an Italian name. And of course, the degree of oppression was just so much that it erupted into conflict. And eventually, the degree of recognition that they have now is not the result of them negotiating with the government and then government saying, well, you have a good point, we agree. The degree of recognition that they have now is the result of a reality that was so stark that the government there, it was in the government's own interest to recognize this. And you can only achieve this by building a particular reality first, by building something first, and then getting recognition for that reality which already exists afterwards.
So would you say here in South Africa, for example, if we look at the rural municipalities where services are absolutely horrible, if someone like Afriforum, for example, or the community themselves take over the responsibilities of the municipality, and then later they go ask the government, can we have this form of self-determination? The government is more likely to say yes, because then they don't need to worry about the municipality anymore. They don't need to spend money on building the sewage or whatever they need in that area. Is that what you're saying? Am I correct?
Yeah. Not necessarily, because there are still demographical issues at play. So if the majority of people who live in that area are still supporters of the ANC government, then they would not do that. But to an extent, yes. I don't think trying to take over a particular municipality would necessarily work unless you have the majority of people, which, as I said, I think is Afrikaners' biggest challenge. Is we are a lot of people, but we are spread out over a very big surface, where we are in the minority almost everywhere we are. So I think a more appropriate way to achieve this would be a path of concentration, to try to be a minority or a majority in a particular section.
A second great track.
Yeah, well, I think you can call it that, yes.
And to what region would you say is the best region to move to if you're a white Afrikaner?
Well, I don't. This is something I'm talking about it in principle now. So I think we can have a more in-depth discussion about this at a later stage. But it's something that I think needs to be investigated. But yeah, it's something I think people. The reason why I say this is because I know that a lot of people who talk about self-determination don't seem to understand that the importance of demographics in this debate.
Yes, I agree with that. In our friends in the liberal media, a lot of people are saying this tour has done a lot more harm than good for the country. The President Cyril Ramaphosa even invited you guys of Afriforum back to the country and told you to come and rather talk to them than go and, as the media call it, besmirch the name of South Africa overseas. Yeah. Why are you going overseas and talking to these people, and why not try to engage in conversation with the government of South Africa?
Well, that's something that we have tried. We do that repeatedly. We repeatedly send emails and we repeatedly send letters and we have discussions and so forth. Let me give you an example. In response to the government saying, why aren't you just talking to us about farm murders? Why are you going abroad? So let's think. The current Minister of Police is Bheki Cele. Before him was Nkosinathi Nhleko. Before him, I think was before him was Fikile Mbalula. Before him, Nkosinathi Nhleko. Before him, Nathi Mthethwa. And I can't remember who was before Nathi Mthethwa. But the last 5 ministers of police that we've had, not a single one of them were prepared to sit down and meet with us and discuss a strategy to combat or to draw up a focused counter strategy to combat farm murders. But what they would do is they would publicly ridicule those who try to campaign for these attacks to be a priority. They would publicly make statements such as farmers are not special, farmers do not deserve special treatment, to use their terms. Farmers are not golden boys and girls, to use that term. So they would make all these claims, and they would repeatedly scorn us and say that they are not interested in talking. And once we go abroad, the first thing they would say is, why aren't you just talking to us? So this is really ridiculous. If they wanted to talk, they've had so many opportunities to talk. So yeah, I think us being here is a result of the fact that our attempts at a solution through dialogue has failed. And we believe that putting pressure on the South African government through international campaigns would severely, or not severely, would greatly benefit our position to speak from a position of authority, to say that, listen, we're not alone in this. This is in your interest as well to prioritize these attacks.
I'm seeing some people now in the comment section is talking about the old commando system, and they are asking, why was it disbanded? Was there any agenda behind the disbandment of the commando system, and can it be reinstated, and if so, why?
Yes, well, the commando system, I've written about it in my book, Kill the Boer, which is coming out on 30 June. The commando system was disbanded in 2003. So just a bit of context there for those who don't know how it worked. It was sort of a civil society initiative, but it was linked to the South African Defence Force. And the way it worked was, especially farmers, especially people in rural communities, could sign up as volunteers, and they helped to maintain law and order in rural areas. So they drove patrols, they had ranks, and they were issued with firearms, but they did this sort of under the umbrella of the National Defence Force. And they've done a lot to keep farm murders under check, and to make sure that people are caught and so forth. Then all of a sudden in 2003, there was, without any prior consultation, without any discussion, the former state president Thabo Mbeki announced during the State of the Nation address that the commando system would be phased out. And even those working with rural safety, the most senior police officers, generals in the SAPS at the time, said, who were working with the commando, said they heard it when they saw it on the news. So there was no consultation. It was just a political decision that was announced, and it was then implemented. And if you ask them why this happened, they would say, they would use a lot of words, but they wouldn't say anything. So they would say things like, it didn't really fit in with the vision that we had of crime prevention in South Africa. But you still don't understand what the motivation is if they say that. So they would have those type of arguments. I think it's safe to speculate. I am speculating, but I think it's safe to speculate that it was for political reasons. I think it's safe to speculate that they were concerned about the fact that a lot of white farmers were involved with the commando systems, and that they in some way saw this as a threat, and that's why it was shut down. That's a speculation, but that's what I think their motivation was, knowing the ANC. The question of whether it can come back, realistically speaking, no. We don't think the commando system would come back as it was. And we also don't think that we should ask for it to come back, because the commando system was still it still fell under the South African National Defence Force, which, of course, as we know, is very inefficient and very corrupt, and increasingly so, especially since 2002 when the commandos were shut down. But there is a lot that people can do today within the framework of the law that boils down to the same thing. So that is why we are encouraging people to come involved with community safety structures, which can do almost everything that the commando system did. And so that's one of our main priorities at the moment. And we as Afriforum we have established more than 100 such community safety structures across South Africa already, but we hope to lift this to several hundred.
I think that is a very noble objective. I'm getting a question here from Jonathan. He's asking, are the farm murders organized terror to demoralize and weaken the resolve of all farmers and whites in South Africa?
Yeah. Well, that's the theme of my book. So the book Kill the Boer has two main overarching themes. The first theme is that farm attacks are not normal crime. And why are these attacks not normal? Why is it different than normal crime? And also added to that, why should it be regarded as a priority crime? Why is it deserving of a focused counter strategy? So that's the first theme. And the overarching theme of the book is really the complicity of the South African government. And so I've written the book, and that's why I'm sure some people have seen pictures of the book already. It's only a proof edition. So we are updating it now. It'll be published on the 30th of June. And actually, once I've written it, I went back into the text. And I found that, incidentally, it boils down to a fixed number, to 10. But I found that there are 10 different ways in which the South African government is complicit to these attacks. And there are some obvious ways, such as the fact that these crimes have been deprioritized. And I think there are, other more obvious ways are also the fact that the reality of hate speech in South Africa, continued singing of kill the Boer, kill the farmer, shoot the Boer, and so forth. But then there are some reasons which I am very concerned about, and I've written quite a few. I was able to find quite a few examples of that, which I mention in the book, is cases where, according to the available evidence, it seems like members of the police were involved with those attacks. And I'm not saying that they are involved with all of the attacks. I'm quite sure that if they are involved, it would be a small minority. But it seems from what I was able to find that there are certainly farm attacks where members of the police are involved. And I write about that in the book. But so the question, if there's a grand strategy, well, let me answer like this. I've tried to look at all the available evidence, and there's not hard evidence of a grand strategy, of someone sitting and planning this in a central committee and then sort of issuing orders and having this executed. And there were attempts by the police as well, a decade or so ago, to try to find out if there was such a grand strategy, and they couldn't find anything. But I don't think, I think that's maybe a misguided search, because there don't need to be a grand strategy, because I think the bigger problem is not the grand strategy. I think the bigger problem is the climate, the political climate, a climate in which farmers, or white farmers in particular, are used as scapegoats and blamed for everything that is wrong with the country, and also in which violence is romanticized up to the highest levels of government, including former President Jacob Zuma singing "Shoot the Boer," singing songs to that effect. Current President Cyril Ramaphosa saying, if you don't vote for the ANC, the Boers are going to come back. All of these statements are ways of negative stereotyping, and in some cases, an active romanticizing of violence against farmers.
Someone's asking, what is the meaning behind of all of these terrible torture methods used in the farm murders?
Are you asking what is the meaning?
Yeah, is there a deeper meaning behind the terrible torture?
Well, I think that is something that really needs to be investigated, and it hasn't been investigated properly. There was a study on farm attacks published in 2003 about which had a section on the motive behind these attacks, and they found that 89% were just motivated by the intention to steal. And I have some serious problems with that finding based on the methodology which they used to reach that conclusion, which I deal with in the book. There are also 10 reasons to judge that conclusion, or to criticize it rather. I can't tell you what the real reason for the tortures are, because there isn't hard evidence to support any claim that I make. But what I can tell you is maybe a speculation, and that is that it is probably a result of a combination of things. The fact that farmers live far away from police stations is certainly one, but not necessarily, because in the book I mention a elderly couple who were severely tortured in one of the most horrible tortures that I've read of, and that their farmhouse was a few hundred meters from a police station. So the fact that farms are far away from police station is not enough to explain this. I think you certainly cannot explain it by saying that those people went there to steal. There's no rational link. You might be able to explain that by saying that there's a degree of racial hatred or ethnic hatred or intimidation. That might be a reason. I think another reason might be a way of expressing power, or showing to the victim that I am now in charge and not you, and therefore I'm going to torture you. So I think there's probably a combination. I don't think there's one single reason why people are tortured. I think it's a combination of circumstantial issues, which I think carry less weight, but also probably political factors, which I think might carry more weight.
I've seen in the news recently, Professor Elmine du Plessis is accusing you of threatening to murder her. Now, that is an absolutely ridiculous claim, but what is your response to that?
Well, I know that she's been saying that she said, well, the context. So she's a professor who's friends with Peter de Tooy, the editor of Huffington Post, and quite incidentally, Peter de Tooy, as we know, he has a very serious agenda against Afriforum and against our campaigns. Incidentally, he started writing to criticize our tour, and at the same time she started writing. So she had this thread on Twitter about why our tour is, I can't even remember the word she used. Misleading, yeah. So, and then she had this thread where she quoted a bunch of statistics, and literally almost, I think every single thing she said was wrong. Not from an opinion perspective, but from a factual perspective. Definitely. So the calculations she made were wrong. It wasn't calculated properly. The statistics she quoted had nothing to do with the conclusions she made. Some of the statistics she quoted were wrong. So what I did was I responded to that, and I basically pointed out how almost every single thing she said was wrong, other than at the end she made some statements about we need to talk to each other and we need to understand each other. And she said we should acknowledge people's personal experience or something like that. And I mean, who can disagree with that? But so other than that, everything she said was literally factually wrong. And I responded to that and pointed that out. And I was making the point that our campaign would never and should never be dependent on the approval of left-wing or progressive intellectuals, because intellectuals, I enjoy studying as well. I've done my master's degree. I did very well with my master's degree. I'm currently doing a doctorate. So I enjoy studying as well. But I do know that from a historical political perspective, intellectuals have there's always been influential intellectuals who have sided with those who were committing the atrocities and who were disregarding of the realities on ground level. And I'm not trying to suggest at all that South Africa is in the same situation as Nazi Germany was, and I make that point very firmly in the book that we shouldn't compare the two. But I was explaining that we cannot expect approval of people like Almin du Plessis, these progressive professors. And to make a point, or to put it in a historical context, I quoted Victor Klemperer, who was a Jew who survived the Holocaust. And he wrote a journal. And after the Holocaust, after all of his family and his friends, they were all killed in the Holocaust, he expressed his anger or rage at the fact that the intellectuals who he thought would have supported him were siding with the Nazis or were disregarding the realities. They weren't prepared to acknowledge what was happening on ground level. And it angered him so much because he was in a different context than we were, because that was a real genocide. There were 6 million people killed there. And he was so angry, he said that if he could have reversed the situation, he would hang all the professors. So, that's very clearly a historical contextual quote that I made. And so then this professor interpreted that, and I see some journalists who are also friends of Huffington Post say that this was a threat, that I was threatening the journalists have to be hanged. That's the biggest leap that I've ever seen in terms of journalistic integrity, to try to interpret this as such. I clearly made the statement in a historical context, and I clearly explained immediately thereafter that when I quote this, I'm not using it literally. I'm trying to put it in a historical context. So I'm not too concerned about this. I know we would always get criticism from those people, and we've received an immense degree of support from South Africa. I've said that elsewhere as well. I think we must have received more than 10,000 messages of support on different platforms. So if there's one professor who's trying to make a scene of this, and also what she's not saying, and people who support her, is that we have received several death threats just flying here after she published her attacks on us, saying to people in South Africa that we are lying and so forth. So for that, by that logic, I should accuse her of threatening me. But if you are in the boxing ring, as we are as Afriforum, we know that if you are in a boxing match, you dish out punches and you get punched back, and you get criticism. And if you want to go and cry every time someone criticizes you, then you should get out of the boxing ring. And we get criticized every single day. I can open my Twitter now, and I can guarantee to you within the last 5 minutes, someone would have said something very nasty about me, or about us being here. And that's how it works. That's what you get if you want to participate in the battle of ideas. But don't go crying if you want to dish out punches, and then when you get criticized back, then you say this is an attack on you. I think we must be very careful to go down that path, and I don't think we must take it too seriously when people prematurely try to participate in this debate in that way.
Yeah, I think she was completely unethical in the way that she stated the facts. To give you an example, where she said it will take 432 years to kill all the farmers, so this clearly is a problem. And then she said 2,652 women were killed last year, while only 74 farmers were killed. Now, that's completely ridiculous the way she stated that, because if you just look at proportionality, if it will take 432 years to kill all the farmers, it means that they are being killed at the rate of 235 out of 100,000, around about there. Now, I'm not saying that's the right statistic, but that's the statistic that she gives. And then if you look at the total population of women in South Africa, which is 26 million, then it gives them a rate of about 9 people killed per 100,000. But she says in this misleading way, trying to mislead people on purpose. And there's no way that she couldn't have known that. I mean, she's got a doctorate, and this is completely, I would say, mouth-breathing stupid to do it in that way. And I don't think she's that stupid. I think that was on purpose that she did it that way, so to mislead the people who are actually stupid enough not to be able to grasp the concept of proportionality.
Yes, I think it's a degree of grasping at straws. And that's why I made a comment about her giving the profession a bad name, because she really, if she was at least prepared to do some research, she would have been able to launch a much more effective attack or criticism. But the way in which she approached it was really very amateurish, and there are much better ways in which to criticize this campaign. Because look, the issue about farm murders is it's a reality. It's a reality in South Africa, and it's a campaign that we are involved with. But there is also an academic component to this, and that's why, I mean, I've written a book about this now, and the book has more than 1,000 source references. So there is an academic component about how do you calculate the statistics and so forth. But her attack was basically quoting misdirected statistics. If she really wanted to do an intellectual criticism, there was so much more that she could have said that would have carried more weight, such as how do we calculate or how should the murder rate per 100,000 be calculated and so forth. But I don't know if she just didn't think about that, but yeah. But maybe I should just add this. As I said, we're not too concerned about this. We are flooded with messages of support being here. But also, as we get confronted with this, it's basically 1 or 2 journalists out of thousands in South Africa who are really trying to discredit this. And these attacks by this person who's a friend of those 2 journalists, I mean, we know that, a very close friend. While this is happening, we are corresponding with the victims back at home. And I get messages, and I made a feedback video about that, and you know, you get quite emotional when you listen to the stories of the victims. And so I can choose who should I take more seriously. Little children in South Africa sending us messages about how they miss their father and how they are so grateful that maybe something would be done, and how we need to try to prevent this from happening to other people, as opposed to this academic or so-called academic trying to criticize us based on fake stats. So, I mean, the answer is very clear. Who should we take seriously and who shouldn't we take seriously? And I mean, I've said this before. I've been affected by these attacks personally, but there are many people, thousands of people in South Africa who've been affected in a much more direct way than I have. And I think that is where we should turn our attention and our focus.
What was the reaction that you got from the people that you have talked to, especially in the USA now, the media and the think tanks and the politicians, to the stats and the facts that you have given to them?
Yeah, well, the reaction is very positive. I cannot speak for them, so I wouldn't say what they said to us. I wouldn't want to paraphrase, and I wouldn't want to put them on the spot in that way. But we've been accepted very positively by everyone we've spoken with. And the people who we've spoken with have different they have different focus areas, and they are positioned differently. So some of them could be outspoken much more severely, or in a much, they could speak out in a much more serious way than others. Some could support in a more strategic way, sort of behind the scenes type of thing. But I can tell you this, that no one that we have spoken with have said to us that, you know what, we've listened to you and we don't think that this is a problem. Everyone agrees this is a very serious problem. Where there were some differences between the people we've spoken with is the way in which they might be able to assist.
And what would that way be, or can you not tell us that?
Yeah, well, what we are asking of think tanks is to write about this, to do research about this, and we've provided them with a lot of research, to advise people who are in positions from which they can take decision-making positions, to advise them on ways in which the United States or whichever role player can put pressure on the South African government not to continue, firstly, with expropriation without compensation, but secondly, not to, well, to do something about these attacks, about farm murders, to prioritize these attacks, and to take the plea of those who want these attacks to be dealt with in terms of a focused counter strategy seriously. What we will be saying to representatives of the US government is that there's a variety of things that they could do to pressure the South African government, which includes legal action in the event of a breach of international treaties, which include ways that this could be dealt with through the United Nations or through foreign policy and so forth. I deliberately don't want to go into the detail there. And what we are calling on investors to do is not to disinvest, but to say to the South African government that we understand what you are doing. You are calling on us to invest in your country, but while you are calling on us to do this, you are initiating a process to expropriate those investments. So you have to choose which side you want your bread to be buttered. Do you want investments or do you want expropriation? You cannot have both. And what we are asking members of the public to do is to speak out about this on public platforms, the way me and you are doing right now, to talk about it on social media, to talk about it with their friends, to talk about it wherever they can, because in doing so, that's the most important way in which public opinion can be influenced.
I definitely agree. I see some people here in the comments section talking about the statement that all South Africans are affected by this crime and farmers are only a small part of the people who are killed every year.
Yeah.
What's your response to that argument?
Yeah, well, the response to that is proportionality. So, yes, that's true. But why? I've never heard anyone argue that the amount of rhinos that are poached is very small in comparison to the amount of animals that are poached in the Table Mountain marine area. I mean, if you compare, there are thousands of species that are poached in the Table Mountain area. And if you compare that to what is happening to rhino poaching, you could say that no, rhino poaching is not that serious. But no one's saying that, because you need to consider proportionality. You need to consider how many rhinos there are, and you need to consider how many marine species there are. That's just one of the ways of looking at this. So the point is, how many people are there? How big is this? What's the size of the group among which these attacks are taking place? So you can say there were 19,000 murders in South Africa, which is horrible, but it's out of 55 million people. Now, all of the victims of farm attacks, or all of the people who are murdered during farm attacks, aren't necessarily commercial farmers. And that's why the statistics, why it's a bit difficult to work with statistics, something that Almin du Plessis doesn't understand. So you cannot just calculate how many farm murders were there and then divide that up by how many farmers are there, because some of the people who are murdered are workers or family members or visitors or so forth. But you can, at least to an extent, make a calculation and say how many of the people who were murdered during farm attacks were commercial farmers, and how many commercial farmers are there in South Africa. And then once you have done that, you can make a calculation. And it might not be 100% accurate, but it still is an indication. And then you would see that if you consider proportionality, that farmers' chances of being murdered are severely higher than the average member of the public. And if you say that, we're not saying let's discriminate against people who are not farmers. Also, I've never heard anyone say, why are you discriminating against kudus, because kudus are also poached? Why do you think rhino poaching is important, but you're not saying something about kudu poaching? I mean, kudu poaching might be a problem, or lion poaching. I mean, all of those things are problems, but there are some different elements attached to rhino poaching, and that's the same with farm murders.
All right. I think we've had a very good conversation, Ernst. Is there anything else that you want to let the people know, let the listeners know before we end this off?
I think, well, maybe I should respond to some of the questions I've received about the book, and then I'll just say something about our tour here. So we've received a lot of interest in the book. And people are asking, when will it be out? So the launch would be on the 30th of June. Other than what I initially thought, the launch would be fairly small, the first launch. So we're going to have several book launches. So we'll probably not be able to invite members of the public to the initial book launch, but there will be several such events. And we will certainly ensure that people are able to do so, to attend one of these launches and get a signed copy and so forth. They can already go to the website. There is a website, killtheboerbook.com. So you can go to killtheboerbook.com. You can sign up there. You can already pre-order a copy, and you can indicate that you intend to attend a book launch, and then we will be sure to make that possible for you. And there's a question about whether it would be on Amazon. I'm quite sure that it would be on Amazon. So we are putting effort into that now. There's a question on which bookstores would sell it. In theory, all of them should be able to sell it. But the biggest thing that people can do now, and we would really like to encourage the viewers to do that, is to go to your local bookstore and ask them about this book, because that's how bookstores work. The more queries they get, the more inclined they are to make sure that they have copies of that book available. So whenever you walk past a bookstore, go in and ask them, do they have Kill the Boer? Do they have the book? Is it out yet? Will they be selling it? It's issued by Kral Publishers, but they'll be able to find that out. So go and inquire about the book. Even though you know it's not out yet, go and ask your local bookstore, will you sell this? And then the other question we got was whether it would be on ebook. And I'm quite sure it would be, but I am not able to answer that question by now, because we are still, our main priority now is to finish the book, the hard copy. So I'm sure it would be. And then the other question was whether it would be on audiobook. And I would very much like to have it out on audiobook. So I'm quite sure that it would be. But our strategy in terms of that would be to have the book published as soon as we can. It's only in English for now. There might be an Afrikaans edition coming out later. You can indicate if you want one on the website. And then there will probably be an ebook, and there will probably be an audiobook. And we will make all of those information, we will make all of that known as we proceed. And then lastly, just moving from the book, I think I should just take a moment to say thank you. We've had an enormous amount of support. We are flabbergasted by the amount of messages we get. You know, there's a big time zone difference. So when we get up in the morning, when we go to bed, that's just about the time when people wake up in South Africa. And then when we wake up, it's about midday in South Africa. So, and then if you go on social media, or if you check your emails, or you check your messages on your phone, every morning we're just blown away by how much support we are getting. So we are really grateful for that. And I want to go even further than that by saying that support has made it possible for us to be here, because the people we are speaking to know that we're not just two individuals talking to them. They know that, firstly, it's a big organization, but secondly, that this is something that really bothers people in South Africa. And the way we've achieved that was through people speaking out on public platforms. So I want to say I really want to say thank you for that.
All right, thank you very much, Ernst, for being on my show. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Willem, and thank you for what you're doing to raise awareness as well.
And thank you to all the people that have watched until now. If you enjoyed the conversation, please remember to leave a like. Goodbye.